1865, the end of slavery in the USA. What really changed? The date is December 6, 1865. Georgia becomes the 27th state to ratify the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Officially, slavery ends. 4 million human beings are declared free. The chains are
The final revolution is here! We will not falter in this great cause!
broken. The human auctions end. Families can no longer be separated and sold like cattle. It is the end of an era that lasted 246 years on American soil. But here is the question that few ask. What really changed on that day? The answer is far more complex and disturbing than history books usually tell. And prepare yourself, because we are going to reveal facts that rarely appear in conventional documentaries, details that have been systematically erased from the official narrative, inconvenient truths that force us to rethink everything we learned about this historic moment. Let's start with something that practically nobody mentions. The 13th Amendment did not completely abolish slavery in the United States. Read with me the complete text of the amendment. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States. See that exception. Except as a punishment for crime. This legal loophole of 7 words allowed slavery to continue existing under another name, and the southern states realized this immediately. Before the ink on the amendment had even dried, southern legislators were already creating laws to transform free black men and women into criminals. And here is the shocking detail. In some southern states, the prison population was practically zero before the Civil War. Why? Because enslaved people did not go to prison. They were punished by their masters. But in 1866, just 1 year after abolition, the prisons of Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, and Georgia exploded with black prisoners. Mississippi's prison population was 100 people in 1864. By 1868, there were more than 1,000 prisoners, and 90% were black. What happened in 4 years? They created what were called the Black Codes. The Black Codes are rarely discussed with the depth they deserve. These laws were of refined cruelty, designed specifically to recreate slavery without using that word. For example, in Mississippi, any black person who could not prove they had a job could be arrested for vagrancy. And here is the diabolical trick. They defined proof of employment so restrictively that it was nearly impossible to comply. You needed a written work contract, white witnesses, documentation that most newly freed people simply had no way to obtain. Once arrested for vagrancy, you were fined. Didn't have money to pay the fine? Perfect. The state would lease you to a farmer, mining company, or railroad construction company that paid your fine in exchange for your labor. And how long did you work? Until you paid off your debt, which curiously always increased because you had to pay for your own food, lodging, and clothes during forced labor. People remained trapped in this system for years, decades, entire generations. And here is something nobody tells you. The conditions of convict leasing were often worse than pre-war slavery. Why? Because when you were someone's property, you had market value. The master had a financial incentive to keep you alive and reasonably healthy. But when you were leased for a year or 6 months, the company had no long-term investment in you. They exploited you to death and simply leased another prisoner. Mortality rates in Alabama coal mines were terrifying. In some years, more than 20% of leased prisoners died. Imagine, 1 in 5 men died within a year. And this was totally legal, completely within the law, protected by the exception in the 13th Amendment. South Carolina had an even more perverse law in the Black Codes. Any black person who worked as an artisan, mechanic, or shopkeeper had to pay an annual fee that ranged from $10 to $100. This may not sound like much, but in 1866, when black workers earned maybe $10 or $15 a month when they were lucky, this fee was prohibitive. The objective was clear: to force black people to work only in agriculture, in the same fields where they had been enslaved. Economic mobility was criminalized. Louisiana went even further. Its Black Codes required every black worker to sign a labor contract at the beginning of January each year. If you didn't have a signed contract by January 10th, you could be arrested. And once you signed a contract, you could not leave that employer during the entire year. even if he mistreated you, didn't pay you, or violated any term of the agreement. You were trapped. Freedom to work, freedom of movement, freedom of choice. Everything was eliminated by law. But let's go back to that initial moment, the first days of January 1866. Imagine you are a newly freed person living in Virginia, North Carolina, or Tennessee. You spent your entire life enslaved. You don't know how to read or write because it was a crime to teach enslaved people, punishable by whipping or imprisonment. You have no money, no land, no tools, nothing but the clothes on your back. Your mother was sold to Texas when you were 7 years old. Your children are scattered between Florida and Arkansas, and now you are free. Free for what exactly? Free to starve? Free to be arrested for not having a job? Free to go back and beg for work from the man who enslaved you? This is the question that nobody was prepared to answer, and that the United States as a nation refused to honestly confront. There was a promise that entered history and became a symbol of betrayed hope. 40 acres and a mule. General William Tecumseh Sherman issued Special Field Order No. 15 in January 1865, redistributing abandoned coastal lands of South Carolina, Georgia, and northern Florida to freed black families. 400,000 acres were distributed to 40,000 black people. Families began to cultivate, build homes, create communities. For the first time, there was real hope of economic autonomy. But here is what they don't tell you. President Andrew Johnson, a Southerner who sympathized with former plantation owners and who assumed office after Abraham Lincoln's assassination, reversed this order in September of the same year. The lands were returned to former Confederate owners, many of whom had taken up arms against the United States. Black families were forcibly expelled from the land they had begun to cultivate, where they had planted seeds, built cabins, started a new life. Federal soldiers supervised the evictions. The promise was broken before it even began to be truly fulfilled. And here is the final insult. Some of these same white farmers who recovered their lands then offered to employ the same black families they had just evicted as sharecroppers. So most freed people had no choice. They returned to the same plantations where they had been enslaved in Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Arkansas, and made agreements with the same men who had kept them in captivity. The sharecropping system was born. On the surface, it seemed fair. You cultivate my land, use my tools and seeds, and when the harvest comes, we split the profits 50-50, or in terms of 1/3 to 2/3, depending on the agreement. But it was an elaborate fraud from the beginning. White farmers controlled the account books. They were the only ones who knew how to do math because they controlled who had access to education. They decided how much the cotton or tobacco harvest was worth, how much the seeds cost, the tools, the lodging, the food provided during the year. And year after year, miraculously, black families always owed money to the farmer at the end of the harvest. They could never get out of debt. There were documented stories of families who worked for 3 generations on the same farm without ever accumulating a single penny of profit. Grandfather, father, and grandson, all trapped by the same system of perpetual debts. And if you questioned the numbers, if you said the calculations were wrong, you could be beaten, expelled with nothing, or worse. And if you owed money, you could not leave the land. Laws were passed throughout the South making it illegal for a worker to leave a farm while they had outstanding debts. If you tried to flee, you were hunted down, brought back, and often arrested for breach of contract, which threw you directly into the convict leasing system. So you were trapped in a cycle, enslaved by debt or enslaved by prison. Free on paper, chained in practice. And this system did not last just a few years or a decade. Sharecropping dominated the rural economy of the South until the 1960s, 100 years after abolition. Here is another fact that is rarely mentioned in its full magnitude. Slavery in 1865 represented the largest concentration of private wealth in the United States. Economists estimate that the market value of 4 million enslaved people was about $3 billion of that time. To put this in perspective, the total annual budget of the federal government was $63 million. The wealth in enslaved human bodies was 50 times greater than the entire federal budget. In values adjusted for today, we are talking about more than $75 trillion. This was the magnitude of stolen wealth, built on unpaid labor, on exploited bodies, on destroyed lives. When abolition happened, who lost this wealth? The slave owners of the South. And who was compensated for 246 years of forced labor? Nobody. Not a penny, not an acre of land, not an official apology. But wait, this is not completely correct. In some cases, it was the enslavers who received compensation, not the enslaved. In the District of Columbia, when slavery was abolished there in 1862, 3 years before the National Amendment, the federal government paid an average of $300 per enslaved person to their owners. $1 million in compensation was paid to slave owners in the District of Columbia. And how much was paid to the 3,000 people who had been enslaved who were finally free? Zero. Absolutely nothing. The message was clear. Property had rights, but the human beings who had been treated as property had no right to anything. During the brief period of Reconstruction, from 1865 to 1877, there were extraordinary advances that are often minimized or completely ignored in school curricula. 16 black men were elected to the National Congress. More than 600 served in state legislatures throughout the South. In South Carolina, blacks came to form the majority in the lower house of the state legislature. Schools were built by the thousands with funding from the Freedmen's Bureau. The literacy rate among black people, which was less than 5% in 1860, jumped to more than 30% in just one decade. Historically, black universities were founded: Howard, Fisk, Morehouse, Spelman. Hiram Revels of Mississippi became the first black senator in 1870, ironically occupying the seat that had belonged to Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy. This was revolutionary, it was transformative, it was the promise of multiracial democracy becoming reality. But here is what they don't tell you about this period. With each advance, there was a massive, organized, and financed violent reaction. The Ku Klux Klan was founded in 1865 in Tennessee by Confederate veterans. Within 5 years, it had cells in all southern states. And it was not just a group of marginal fanatics in the shadows. It was a sophisticated paramilitary terrorist organization that operated openly, with tacit or explicit support from political leaders, sheriffs, judges, businessmen. They had uniforms, hierarchy, strategy. They assassinated black voters on the eve of elections. They burned schools built for black children. They lynched teachers who dared to educate blacks. They raped black women with impunity. They tortured and killed community leaders, black politicians, anyone who challenged white supremacy. And it worked. In some counties in Mississippi and Louisiana, where blacks were the majority and were voting en masse after the 15th Amendment of 1870, Klan terror reduced black electoral participation from more than 90% to less than 5% in just 2 years. In 1873, the Colfax Massacre happened in Louisiana. White militias attacked and massacred between 150 and 300 black men, most already surrendered and unarmed, in one of the worst episodes of racial violence during Reconstruction. 3 white men were eventually convicted, but the Supreme Court reversed the convictions, establishing a precedent that the federal government had limited power to protect black citizens against racial violence. The message to black people was, "You are on your own." The end came in 1877. The presidential election of 1876 between Rutherford Hayes and Samuel Tilden was contested, with disputed results in Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. To resolve the impasse, a corrupt deal known as the Compromise of 1877 was made. Hayes would become president in exchange for withdrawing all federal troops from the South, effectively abandoning federal protection of black rights. Reconstruction ended, and with it, the brief window of hope for genuine racial equality ended. The Southern states were free to create the Jim Crow system of legalized racial segregation that would last almost 90 years. But before Jim Crow fully consolidated, there was something even more sinister: the era of mass lynchings that reached its peak between 1883 and 1923. Records document more than 4,000 lynchings of black people in the United States during this period, but this number is certainly a massive underestimation because many lynchings in rural areas were never recorded or reported. And here is the horror. Lynchings were not secret acts committed by hooded criminals in the dead of night. Many were public events announced in newspapers with thousands of white spectators, including entire families with small children. Photographs were taken of the victims hanged and burned, and these photos were sold as postcards in stores. Pieces of bodies, fingers, ears were taken as souvenirs. It was racial terrorism as public policy, designed to send a clear and unequivocal message. You may be free on paper, but you will never be our equals, you will never be safe, you will never be truly free as long as we are in control. And it worked. It worked for generations. So we return to the original question that started this journey. What really changed in 1865 when slavery officially ended in the United States? The honest and complete answer is that everything changed and very little changed simultaneously. Slavery as a legal institution ended, and this is not trivial or unimportant. Families could finally remain together legally. People could move geographically without needing passes. They could learn to read and write without it being a crime. They could marry legally before the law. They could keep their own children without fear of seeing them sold. These were monumental, transformative changes, purchased with blood in the bloodiest civil war in American history that cost 600,000 lives. But the ideological infrastructure of white supremacy remained intact. It just adapted and evolved.